Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on voting rights, the Great Society, and the bureaucracy of equal access. The core question is this: how much federal machinery should a democracy build when local officials have already learned how to destroy equal citizenship with office hours, forms, and selective delay? The core competency is to discuss the emergence of organized resistance efforts to racial injustice across the American South. How much federal machinery should a democracy build when local officials have already learned how to destroy equal citizenship with office hours, forms, and selective delay? Selma and the Great Society belong in the same lecture because both exposed inequality as administration. Black citizens in Dallas County, Alabama were not excluded from power only by open violence. They were excluded by registrars who controlled application timing, literacy interpretation, voucher requirements, and who got called next. Poor and elderly Americans were not shut out of medical care only by bad luck. They were shut out by hospital billing, local welfare patchworks, insurance gaps, and state systems that could deny access while claiming to follow the rules. That is why 1965 stands as more than a moral climax. Congress and the Johnson administration did more than issue declarations. They built enforcement channels. The Voting Rights Act created federal review over local election practice. Medicare and Medicaid tied federal money to large systems of reimbursement, inspection, and compliance. The same decade that celebrated freedom also wrote manuals, regulations, formulas, and deadlines because rights without operating procedure had already proved too weak. The Southern freedom struggle supplied the pressure. Grassroots workers, churchwomen, local teachers, SNCC field secretaries, ministers, and ordinary citizens made disenfranchisement visible and unmanageable. Television brought Selma into northern living rooms, but local people had already spent years trying to register in courthouses where white officials treated the franchise like private property. The federal state expanded because local democracy had revealed its own bad faith. That leaves a durable civic problem. If equality requires clerks, investigators, grant administrators, federal lawyers, and pre-clearance review, then the country has admitted that local institutions cannot be trusted to govern fairly by habit alone. That admission had transformative power in 1965. It also produced an administrative inheritance that later generations would attack, defend, and inherit without easy exit. Before the Voting Rights Act, the formal right to vote already existed under the 15th Amendment, and that fact is part of the indictment. Southern officials had spent decades learning how to empty the amendment without openly repealing it. Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, character vouchers, registration purges, white primaries before Smith v. Allwright, and discretionary office procedures kept black registration low across the Deep South. In counties where black people formed large parts of the population, they could still be nearly absent from jury pools, elected office, and sheriff oversight because the registrar held the gate. Dallas County, Alabama, where Selma sat, illustrates the mechanism. The courthouse opened registration on irregular schedules. Applicants might wait all day and never be processed. Clerks could require recitation of constitutional passages, reject forms for minor technicalities, or simply close the line. Sheriff Jim Clark and local deputies reinforced the message with intimidation. The injury was therefore institutional. A citizen could be told the right existed while every practical route to exercise it remained controlled by hostile officials. The civil rights laws already passed by 1964 had weakened other parts of Jim Crow. Brown attacked school segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 targeted public accommodations and employment discrimination. Yet voting remained the lever that determined who staffed the courthouse, ran the school board, and controlled county budgets. Without the ballot, black communities could win symbolic access and still remain governed by white office holders, insulated from consequence. In Alabama and neighboring states, the registration process itself was engineered to waste courage. Applicants could be handed long forms demanding exact personal data, employment history, and references from already registered voters. They could be told to copy or interpret constitutional passages to the satisfaction of an official who never intended satisfaction. In some counties, the registrar's office opened only a few days each month, which meant farm workers, maids, and day laborers had to choose between wages and a trip that might end in refusal. Sheriff departments then kept license plates, employer names, and church affiliations in mind for retaliation after the courthouse door closed. Healthcare before Medicare and Medicaid showed a parallel kind of rationing. Many elderly Americans lacked hospital insurance. Private insurance often followed employment or income patterns that excluded poor households. Rural clinics were thinly funded. Segregated hospitals in the South maintained separate wards, admissions practices, or staffing arrangements. Local welfare medicine varied sharply by state. Health access was therefore uneven before anyone even entered an examining room. The system distributed risk and dignity through billing structures and local political choice. There were alternatives before 1965, and many moderates preferred them. The federal government could keep relying on private lawsuits after violations occurred. Presidents could continue appointing small numbers of voting rights investigators without rewriting the national system. Health policy could remain partly charitable, partly local, partly private. Those options had one political advantage. They preserved local control language. They had one practical defect. Local control had already been used for years as a shield for exclusion. The movement pressure that culminated in the Voting Rights Act came from a long sequence rather than one march. SNCC workers had spent years in places such as Mississippi and southwest Georgia, organizing citizenship schools, teaching registration procedure, gathering local testimony, and trying to break through courthouse control. Freedom Summer in 1964 showed the scale of resistance. Local people risked eviction, firing, beatings, and murder for trying to register. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party then challenged the all-white regular delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony reached a national audience and made gradual language sound obscene. Selma was chosen because the local repression was visible and measurable. The county had a black majority, but only a tiny fraction of registered black voters. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined local organizers already at work there. They staged courthouse demonstrations, night marches, and church meetings that made administration itself the subject. Every delay, every denial, every arrest showed that the registrar's desk was as political as any legislative chamber. The march from Selma to Montgomery became a crisis because the state answered with open force. On March 7, 1965, state troopers in Postman attacked marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with clubs, whips, tear gas, and mounted charges. The event, later known as Bloody Sunday, compressed years of local obstruction into images that national audiences could not easily domesticate. Johnson addressed Congress 8 days later and used the phrase, "We shall overcome," linking presidential rhetoric to movement pressure while also preparing Congress for a deeper federal intervention. If local registrars can block citizenship by controlling forms and timing, then the federal government must either supervise them directly or admit that the franchise is conditional by county. The Voting Rights Act chose supervision. Section 2 banned voting practices that denied or abridged voting rights on account of race. Section 4 created the coverage formula that identified jurisdictions using tests or devices with low registration or turnout. Section 5 then required covered jurisdictions to obtain federal preclearance before changing voting rules. That reversed the burden. Instead of injured citizens suing after the damage, counties had to prove changes were not discriminatory before implementation. Federal examiners and registrars became the sharp edge of that change. The Department of Justice and federal officials could enter places where local officials had monopolized the franchise. Applications could now be reviewed outside the courthouse culture that had previously decided who counted. Registration numbers rose dramatically in parts of the South because the law targeted administration rather than only condemning intention. The Selma campaign also demonstrated how carefully movement pressure and federal action had to be sequenced. On February 18, 1965, state troopers and local officers attacked demonstrators in Marion, Alabama, and Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot after trying to protect family members inside Mac's Cafe. His death helped drive the decision to march from Selma to Montgomery. After Bloody Sunday on March 7th and the violent dispersal at the bridge, activists attempted a second march on March 9th before turning back under a federal restraining order. Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. then authorized the full march, and by March 21st, federalized Alabama National Guard troops, FBI monitors, and U.S. Army personnel were helping secure the 54-mile route along U.S. Highway 80. The right to petition the state ended up requiring camp permits, field kitchens, portable toilets, route plans, and a military shield against the state that had beaten marchers days earlier. The Great Society expanded federal reach by related means. Medicare, enacted in 1965 under Title VII of the Social Security Act, created hospital insurance for the elderly. Medicaid, under Title XIX, established a joint federal-state program for certain low-income populations. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare then used certification and reimbursement power to push Southern hospitals toward desegregation. A hospital that wanted Medicare funds could not casually preserve segregated wards and claim federal neutrality. Inspectors, compliance reviews, and payment systems turned federal spending into a civil rights instrument. HEW enforcement worked through paperwork as surely as the courthouse had. Hospitals filed assurances of compliance, submitted bed allocation and staffing information, and faced on-site review teams before July 1st, 1966, the date Medicare payments began. Black physicians who had long been excluded from admitting privileges could now use federal leverage against local boards that had hidden segregation behind medical custom. In Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, administrators who wanted access to the huge new flow of federal reimbursements had to decide whether maintaining white-only rooms was worth losing payment streams that could keep the hospital solvent. This was not cheap, simple, or politically innocent. Conservatives and some local officials attacked the expansion as bureaucratic overreach. Some liberals worried that a rights regime dependent on federal capacity might remain vulnerable whenever national political will weakened. Yet the previous arrangement had already shown its own political meaning. It left equal citizenship dependent on the goodwill of officials whose authority rested on exclusion. The Great Society did not enter a neutral landscape. It entered a field that had been engineered against equal access for decades. The decisive language in the Voting Rights Act lies in its refusal to wait politely for harm to accumulate. Section 2 speaks of any voting qualification or procedure that would deny or abridge the right to vote on account of race. Section 4 names tests or devices as the operating tools of disfranchisement. Section 5 then creates preclearance, which is the real administrative revolution. A covered jurisdiction could not change district lines, registration practice, polling locations, or electoral procedures unless federal authorities approved the change in advance. That choice tells you what Congress thought it had learned from the South. The old model of civil rights enforcement assumed injured citizens would sue after being harmed. Congress in 1965 concluded that post-injury litigation was too slow when local systems were built for procedural evasion. The law therefore treated local election administration as an object of prior federal scrutiny. The statute was written in the shadow of courthouse refusals, registrar trickery, and televised beatings, and its phrasing carries that distrust in every operative clause. Johnson's speech to Congress helped generate the votes, but the statute reveals more than the speech because it shows where moral outrage landed. It landed in coverage formulas, examiner appointments, and federal review authority. Committee staff, movement witnesses, and administration lawyers were not looking for uplift alone. They were drafting a federal choke point aimed at counties that had spent decades using paperwork, delay, and intimidation to preserve white rule. Selma supplied the emergency. The act supplied the machinery. Placed beside Medicare enforcement, the pattern is even clearer. In both cases, Washington stopped pretending that equal treatment would appear through aspiration alone. A county seeking to change its electoral rules and a hospital seeking federal reimbursement now faced review from outside local custom. The national state did not become neutral referee. It became active monitor, and that role redefined citizenship in the South and beyond. The immediate consequences were measurable. Black voter registration climbed across covered jurisdictions. Courthouse monopolies weakened. Elected offices, jury pools, and local patronage systems began to shift because the electorate itself changed. Hospitals that had maintained open segregation faced federal pressure through reimbursement systems. Medicare and Medicaid widened access while enlarging the federal role in daily medical administration. Equal citizenship became more real because Washington inserted itself into the local process. The deeper consequence was structural. The rights revolution of 1965 condemned injustice and installed a federal bureaucracy of suspicion toward local authority. Preclearance assumed local election changes might be instruments of discrimination. Health and welfare enforcement assumed public money could not be handed over without rules, inspections, and sanctions. That was the political inheritance of Selma, a democratic state admitting that some parts of democracy had to be supervised. There's no easy sentiment to close on. A society that had honored local discretion for generations had used that discretion to ration ballots, hospital access, and basic dignity. The federal response worked because it distrusted local innocence. But once equality depends on permanent review, formula, and oversight, the Republic has accepted that justice may require an enforcement machine large enough to provoke its own backlash and small enough to fail the moment the will to use it thins out.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.